For those of you who have been with us all day, thank you for your loyal participation. And for those of you joining us just now, welcome. One quick logistical note before our introduction. After tonight's keynote address, we will do our fourth breakout session for the Midwestern History Conference. That should end around 8:15. And around 8:30, we're going to meet in the exhibition hall just outside to walk over to the Waldron for the Midwestern History Association's awards ceremony. And with that, I am happy now to introduce our final keynote speaker of the day, Jefferson Cowie. Professor Cowie holds the James G. Stallman Chair in the Department of History at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, where he moved after teaching at Cornell for 18 years. His work in social and political history focuses on how class, inequality, and labor shape American politics and culture. The Nation magazine described Jefferson Cowie as one of our most commanding interpreters of recent American experience. His most recent book, The Great Exception, The New Deal and the Limits of American Politics, was published by Princeton University Press early in 2016. E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post called it one of the year's most important political books. Professor Cowie's 2010 book, Stayin' Alive, The 1970s and the Last Days of the Working Class, published by the New Press, won the Francis Parkman Prize from the Society of American Historians and the Merle Curdy Award from the Organization of American Historians, which also named Professor Cowie a distinguished lecturer in 2015. Raised in the Midwest, Professor Cowie was educated at UC Berkeley and UNC Chapel Hill. His presentation today is titled Blue-Collar Nationalism in an Age of Decline, The Search for Citizenship. Please help me welcome Professor Cowie.
Good evening, everybody. And thanks to Scott and John and everybody behind the scenes who have done such a great job on putting this program together. I do have one note that I have reported you to the Fair Labor Standards Act Administration for violations of the 8-hour day law, but we'll let that go. The talk I'm going to give today is very experimental. It's sort of almost a thought experiment, I guess, or a thought. It's a wild pitch, okay? But I am at the crossroads of a series of intellectual problems that I'm trying to reason my way out of after those two books that you just heard about, and even the one before that, Capital Moves. People say, well, what are we supposed to do? And I would always say, I don't know, I'm an historian, I do the past, somebody else does the future. But this keeps coming around to me. So we obviously live in an age of tremendous inequality, and it's growing. And economic inequality equals political inequality. And those two things are going hand in hand, and it's getting worse. Yet I came along in that last book and made the argument, well, the big panacea of the 20th century, the New Deal, which righted questions of inequality, at least, or mitigated issues of inequality, is not a viable model, is not recreatable. And then in Staying Alive, I declared the end of the working class, which got me in lots of trouble with my colleagues in labor history. Then Donald Trump was elected. And we have since, building off 2 decades of political fragmentation. On top of all of those questions, I inevitably find myself driven back to these questions of class politics and identity politics that have informed so much political debate as of late. And this is a very powerful, messy stew, a problematic that I've been trying to find my way out of. And I'm going to do what I hope today will be a very controversial solution. And as I say, it's a thought experiment, so what I'm doing is I'm inviting a dialogue, I'm inviting discussion to see what you think about it and how it might work and how much more you're going to hate me after this talk is over. The epigram of this piece is from geographer James Shortridge. It says, Quote, "The Middle West came to symbolize the nation, to be seen as the most American part of America." You may have read recently that Ben Rhodes, President Obama's deputy national security advisor, wrote a book and a memoir of his time in the administration. And it opens with Rhodes riding in a limousine along with Obama as they're analyzing the Trump victory in 2016. They're actually in Lima, Peru, of all places. And Obama was struggling to understand what just happened, how his 8 years ended in Donald J. Trump's victory. And Trump turned to Rhodes and said, "What if we were wrong?" He had just read a column arguing that liberals had failed to recognize how important identity was to people and how empty and left behind cosmopolitan globalism had made many voters feel. Maybe we pushed too far, Obama wondered. Maybe people just want to fall back on their own tribe. Excuse me. And those comments from the end of his second term bookend the controversial, perhaps now infamous, thoughts that he had made 8 years earlier during the 2008 campaign. Remarks he had to apologize for that went like this. "You go into these small towns in Pennsylvania, and like a lot of small towns in the Midwest, the jobs have been gone now for 25 years, and nothing's replaced them. And they fell through the Clinton administration and through the Bush administration, and each successive administration has said that somehow these communities are going to regenerate, and they have not. And it's not surprising that they get bitter, that they cling to guns or religion or antipathy toward people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-trade sentiment as a way to explain their frustrations." And this created a minor firestorm, both in the Republican Party and with his opponent Hillary Clinton at the time. But I think Obama put his finger in both cases on a problem that I think he intuitively recognized. He was feeling it as a candidate and as a president, but one that he had very difficult time mobilizing around. And that is the question of identity in this time of tremendous inequality in both wealth and political power. In this dizzying world of global trade, immigration, technological disruption, people were seeking grounding in time and place. And I think as Barack Obama's mini history of this problem, this question suggests, economic nationalism, the problem I want to talk about today, had been brewing for a very, very long time in the United States. So let's roll back the clock a little bit. Few scenes capture the impotent rage of the American working class better than the occasional event at a United Auto Workers picnic in the 1980s. There, for a small donation, an angry union member could take the sledgehammer and work out his or her rage on an innocent Toyota Corolla. In the parking lot at those picnics or at the down at the plant, the bumper sticker said, "Buy American, the job you save may be your own." While if you were a worker there, you had to park your car. If it was an American made, you could park it up by the plant. If it was foreign made, it was either not allowed in the parking lot or you had to park it way out in the back 40 of the parking lot. In fact, when I was doing my dissertation research, I would park my Subaru many blocks away and walk to the Union Hall before I did my interviews. So these symbolic national responses to the emergence of the transnational economy like these, I think, vented much more anger than they passed legislation, of course. But I'd like to argue tonight that we dismiss the sentiment at our peril. The Toyota-pounding nationalist moods of the 1970s and 1980s hides the fact that the battle lines these workers faced were a lot less clear than they had been previously. Non-union Japanese transplants, as they were called, were landing in the United States and employing lots of American workers, while cars imported from Germany and Sweden were being built under some of the best union contracts in the world. Transnational labor solidarity with union sisters and brothers around the world turned out to be a bit of a political wisp in the trade winds when it was this job in this town that was on the chopping block. The old battle between us and them in labor history had become muddled, difficult to draw. Robert Reich, who would go on to be Secretary of Labor under Clinton, wrote 2 articles in 1990 and 1991 that I think are really smart, with the revealing titles, Who is Us and Who is Them? Now, one way to encapsulate the broad sweep of labor history is to tell the story of unions based on locals, breathlessly chasing after the ever-widening geographic command of capital, right? The size of the market, whether it's the market in labor or goods, but especially market. And they almost always find themselves trying to catch up, except, of course, during the post-war golden age, as it's called, when the U.S. was over-dominant in the world economy and workers were buoyed up by a host of New Deal legislation and union power. Wages went up, inequality went down, union density went up, economic liberalism was robust, to the point that actually workers regarded themselves as recipients of the bounty of trade liberalization under the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade, GATT, and organized labor even supported things like the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Now, while much of this bounty privileged white male industrial workers, the formula proved beneficial across the board. But then the expansion of the labor market reached the water's edge. A dozen years later, after the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, foreign cars, foreign electronics, foreign steel, foreign garments, and most of the point, the offshoring of production of domestic brands rattled the domestic piece of the post-war trade regime. The sense of workers' fall from economic grace was not mere American anxiety, paranoia, racism, or metaphor. It was very real. Now, not surprisingly, when the post-war settlement began to unravel, workers sought to reestablish national control over the globalizing labor market. Akin to farmers seeking parity doctrine based on the pre-World War I agricultural golden age, workers, union leaders, and liberals frantically struggled to shore up the old system. Advocates of the Burke-Hartke federal foreign trade and investment proposal sought to impose quotas, eliminate tax provisions, regulate overseas investment. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, you may recall, sang, "Look for the union label," endlessly on television ads throughout the 1970s. Buy American campaigns emerged in a number of industries. Then other tools like anti-dumping agreements, currency manipulation, voluntary trade restraints agreements, and agreements with other nations to import certain quantities of American goods, which we've seen China just come back to do, all tried to prop up this sort of rickety system. And it became mandatory for politicians to tip their hat to closing the tax loophole that assisted foreign investments, as if the entire problem were merely a few lines sinisterly slipped into the tax code. So I think what these many initiatives suggest is that the political lines between a sort of laissez-faire cosmopolitanism and working people grounded in place and nation began to be drawn. Now, obviously, we should be suspicious of any clean binary here, but work with me. As Mario Cuomo argued in his 1984 Democratic keynote, the nation was becoming less a shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan had claimed, and more of a tale of two cities, one of opulence and one of suffering and despair. When Ronald Reagan launched his candidacy for the presidency, he declared himself in favor of a new idea. A North American Accord, he called it, on trade and development. The concept would eventually be signed as the North American Free Trade Agreement by his successor, George H.W. Bush, in 1992, and passed through Congress with tremendous wrangling by President Bill Clinton. Now, Reagan's populist magic allowed him to own sort of the rally around the flag nationalism while blocking and or destroying any domestic economic security dimensions that might be coupled with that. So simultaneously, he could sort of advance the nationalism while promote a global labor market in both labor and other commodities. The rest of the 1980s proved hard to find the right word. For the Midwestern working class, the rest of the 1980s really kicked in the few remaining teeth that they had with a direct assault on residual legal protections workers enjoyed, leaving industrial workers ravaged in, to quote Bruce Springsteen, a dead man's town with little more than pounding and empty claims of being born in the USA. By the 1980s, when NAFTA advocates sought to codify the New World Order, labor launched a Just Say No campaign against the trade deal, hemmed in, of course, by Fast Track Authority, which has said you can only vote this up or down. But they failed to generate any alternatives or ideas even, or even note the fact that hundreds of thousands of U.S. jobs had already relocated to Mexico. The anti-NAFTA struggle ended up largely as one big America First rally, with occasional flickers of solidarities with workers in Mexico and Canada. Now, the battle in Seattle, 1999, offered a fleeting moment of labor's capacity to act globally and environmentally, but that never really took deep root in American political culture. By then, NAFTA and Clinton had become toxic terms throughout the heartland, as industrial workers felt that the Democrats had betrayed them. By the new millennium, the Democrats had stumbled on the same problem that tripped up many reformist and social democratic parties around the world. Jumping on a cosmopolitan, laissez-faire global position denied the central fact that the nation-state was and would remain the place where workers' rights are recognized, that infrastructure is built, and wealth redistribution can happen. I actually don't like the word wealth redistribution. I prefer pre-distribution, which is to say workers actually earn it. They don't get it from some redistribution mechanism, but they earn it through pay, good pay. So social democracy, where liberals make their mark, is a national project and cannot be robust if capitulation to the transnational order is the essence of politics. This is what one critic of the floundering German social democrats identified as, quote, the convenient self-delusion of the neoliberal decades was that you could strengthen both national democracy, including welfare state capitalism, and transnational policymaking, when in fact one undermined the other. This is why Donald Trump's reboot of America First was a long time coming, as was Obama's sort of existential crisis about the nature of his 8 years in office. And I don't think this idea of America First may not be quite as crazy as it initially sounds. For all of the sort of insanity around the Trump administration, he is right on two really important and often ignored points that no other candidate brought up. And that is, American workers are sold out and the system is rigged. Nobody else is making that argument, except for maybe Bernie Sanders, who was trying to make a class-based argument to a culture that has, I think, largely become tone-deaf to the question of class as a political category. And the lessons of Trump's America First appeal is not that Midwestern and other white workers are irredeemably provincial and racist, though many are, but that the nation-state remains the only imaginable place of redress, even in a global age. Nationalism and populism are on the rise around the world, but they need to be understood within the claustrophobic global determinism that mocks national governments, mocks political identity, and mocks the capacity for people to act in their community's behalf. The problem is far more complex than the typical question, trade expansion, yes, trade expansion, no. So not surprisingly, many working class communities began to look in the rearview mirror, or worse, lashing out in racist and ethnocentric rants of the Trump variety. The idea that, as Trump said, Hillary Clinton will escalate the war on the American worker, as Trump said, is a credible political message. Do people buy that Trump will bring industry back? I don't think so. As Dee Davis, a rural development activist in West Virginia, put it, Trump's attention in places like former coal communities, quote, elevated our story. It put us right back in the center of the American discussion, close quote. It was the politics of recognition rather than the continued humiliation. And here we should only think of Hillary Clinton's remarks about deplorables, or her insulting eagerness to use less coal with nothing to replace it. Davis continues, the thing about rural America is we now take our identity more and more by what we used to do. We used to be farmers. We used to be loggers. We used to work at the plant. Well, in this area, we used to be coal miners. that politics of past betrayal is still, he says, a viable political message, and it's being weaponized. So today we're left with an invisible geographic wall of economic opportunity that separates the urban centers of dynamism and the dead zones beyond, without anything real besides decreasing life expectancy, hollowed out towns, drug dependency to replace the once vibrant stake in the system. John Russo and Sherry Lincoln, two scholars with deep roots in Youngstown, Ohio, argue that the much vaunted Schumpeterian process of creative destruction has been, quote, replaced by the politics of resentment. So the global rise of ethnocentric nationalism needs to be feared deeply. But the concept of shared national fate and commitment can and should be harnessed. The possibility of a dynamic, outward-looking version of national economic strategy might be able to place the full cultural, racial, and geographic diversity of American workers first, in a place between, on the one hand, the combination of free trade plus sort of the nationalist rebel yellow of the Republicans, and then on the other hand, the weak-kneed corporate neoliberal diversity of the Democrats. The key is to transcend the dominant backward-looking protectionism or any attempt to capture the labor market in some moment of arrested decay that defined much of the 80s and 90s as I open this talk, and to harness the state and the vision of it for the public good. Why the nation remains prostrate before Wall Street's demands for ever bigger and faster buybacks, bigger bonuses, while the street actively shuns the type of long-term experimentation, research, worker training, product development, infrastructure construction, green economy development, healthcare access, education promotion, and wealth redistribution are among the worst symptoms of the problem. In some ways, this is an even deeper problem. In 1910, Teddy Roosevelt went to Osawatomie, Kansas. And there he said, the prime problem of our nation is to get rid of is to get the right type of good citizenship. And I think it still is. At Osawatomie, addressing an enthusiastic crowd of 30 or 40,000 people for more than 90 minutes, standing on a kitchen table in front of the crowd, Roosevelt put forth what he called the New Nationalism agenda, in which he asserted the priority of labor over capital, of human welfare over property rights, of equality of opportunity, of accountability of corporate officers and directors, of the revision of the financial system to avoid financial panics. Working people want to pledge their allegiance to a country that will reciprocate with a pledge of allegiance to them. I think that is the lesson of Trump. And I think a vision of the nation matters. My favorite anecdote about the power of the nation, or Americanism, is one of Ronald Reagan's aides, having watched his candidate give a full-throated paean to national greatness in 1984, turned to a campaign worker and said, I feel sorry for Walter Mondale. He has to run against America. And this is an unwinnable contest. America will always win. Like Reagan before him, in our own time, Trump throws into stark relief just exactly what the Democrats should have taken in their turn to the right in the 1980s. Not the policies that foster great inequality, but a vision of citizenship. While the rebooted phase, it's hard to say, the rebooted phase, one more try. The rebooted phrase, America First, is associated with the isolationist committee that sought to thwart the United States' entry into World War II. It actually has earlier roots. At the earlier roots of the type, those auto workers smashing the Toyota Corollas would have understood. In 1891, an editor wrote to the New York Times saying that about the Republican tariff. America first, he said, means the rest of the world afterward. And the phrase actually went on to be a Republican slogan in the 1890s. In 1894, and especially, and by 1900 became the more famous phrase, the politics of the full dinner pail. So while many on the cosmopolitan left, and I include myself in that world, find visions of national anything maudlin, if not petrifying, the nation-state has long been the main place of redress and identity for working people, and it will continue to be so in the foreseeable future. And if a progressive nationalism, both social and economic, cannot be created, then progressive victories will probably only be short-lived, and the slow drift toward a blood and soil nationalism will continue unabated. So the lesson of the Trump election is not that the white working class is too fixated on resenting identitarian movements to ever embrace progressive politics. Working people, even members of the white working class, can and will be progressive if they aren't anxious that progress will itself be distributed according to identity categories, gracing everyone but themselves. On the other hand, the politics of class, qua class, are a long way off from reality in the United States, and the labor movement is not going to come rushing in to save the day. We need to change the battlefield of the culture wars from who is in and who is out to we're in this together. Now, dissenting movements have thrown the nation-state under the bus for its oppression, its whiteness, its dark nationalism. But I think what that means by doing so is to have given up the story, the national arc. They're reminiscent, today I think dissenting movements are reminiscent of James Baldwin's criticism of the stridency of the American protest novel. Quote, a mirror of our confusion, dishonesty, panic, trapped and immobilized in the sunlit prison of the American dream, end quote. And dark forces are ready to move on that prison if enlightened ones do not. Where is what FDR called the search for, quote, a safer, happier, more American America? In his efforts to reconfigure class power, he did not make claims on behalf of workers of the poor. He simply said that taxation of the rich was the American thing to do. So this potential framework I'm groping for, call it civic nationalism, call it multicultural nationalism, call it national solidarity, civic patriotism, social patriotism, perhaps just civic investment, begins with a kind of a workaround under this in this unsubtle and exhausting debate between class and identity politics. A debate, I think, in which sort of progressives have mostly affirmed their capacity to eat each other alive. After the election, Mark Lilla threw the latest fireball at the divisiveness of identity politics, that is, of course, the building of political positions based on race, gender, and sexual identities, arguing that it's largely an expressive, not persuasive form of politics, one that fixates on the narcissism of difference. It creates a circular firing squad rather than a collective agenda. And like many others who have made similar arguments about identity politics, he faced a storm of criticism, much of which merely expressed the obvious, that systematic state-sponsored discrimination based on racial, gender, and cultural categories is alive and well in the United States. And we have an unholy amount of dismantling to get through before we can begin to even talk about the types of politics of class that Lilla and his allies argue for. So people like Lilla, who posit the New Deal and post-war era as some sort of antediluvian time of pre-identity politics, back when collective economic interests regulated by the nation-state could reign supreme, I think miss some very important and troubling history. The New Deal golden age that these critics celebrate as pre-identity politics was hardly that. As I argued in The Great Exception, the most divisive and tribal issues in American politics today, race, immigration, religious identity, the culture wars, function in a very, very different way in the post-war era, and the New Deal excluded protections for predominantly African-American occupations, such as agriculture and service work, keeping such laborers outside of Social Security, collective bargaining, and fair labor standards. That was, of course, in order to preserve the unholy alliance with Southern Democrats that Northern progressives needed to pass their cherished reforms. Large-scale immigration had been shut down in 1924, did not reopen until 1965, and even the post-World War II era is seen by religious scholars as a time of religious truce, during which a new invention called Judeo-Christian values stood up to the international threat of godless communism. My point is that once you factor out by hook or crook the persistent pressures of social, ethnic, and cultural heterogeneity in American politics, it becomes a lot easier to pass quote-unquote class politics that begin to look like a modest version of social democracy in America. It is a truism of political science that social democracy flourishes best among homogeneous populations. And the realm of post-war American politics was more homogeneous in a forced way than the period before the 30s or after the 1970s. This allowed a sort of blinkered version of class politics to exist. So I don't think a return to that golden age is the appropriate tactic. Now, Lilla, Todd Gitlin, Walter Ben Michaels, Adolph Reed, many of these people are my friends, I think they get a little irrationally misty-eyed about the politics of class, but they are right to castigate the current politics of identity and diversity in the way they've become sort of handmaidens of a desperate neoliberal capitalism. Even perfect access, without any discrimination, to the current labor market cannot be called a success when the system itself is falling apart. You can have criminally overpriced health care, you can have a precarious job, or no job. Even gilded with a commitment to diversity, the economic inequality is a nightmare. So in this light, the conflict between identity and class politics appears much less a political philosophical binary than a messy historical problem that I'm looking to work around. The selling so in 2016, when Trump won, claiming that he would make America great again, he offered almost nothing but hot air for policy, except for the promise, I think, of infrastructure development, which we've yet to see. And Hillary Clinton lost with a vapid, vaguely feminist slogan, "I'm with her," and a laundry list of smart policies. It's an old story. Jimmy Carter lost because he said there was a crisis of confidence. Reagan won because he believed in national greatness. Time and again, the language of national vision will trump these other, no pun intended, questions. So, the country, I think, is starved for a meaningful politics of, dare I say it, what it means to be an American. It's what all of that blue-collar nationalism was about in the 1980s and the 1990s. And I think without it, working people are left to bear the local burdens of a cosmopolitan elite who have essentially seceded from the American project. But by changing the playing field from a limited us versus them terrain to the United States of America as a whole is not easy. And it's certainly not the most politically correct or ideologically pure approach, and sometimes I can't even believe I'm saying this. But in the great tradition of American pragmatism, I think it's the one that works. And when I say pragmatism, I'm not talking about the salad version, I'm talking about John Deweyan pragmatism. In fact, I'm basically arguing what Richard Rorty argued in Achieving Our Country back in 1997 or 8. Looking at Walt Whitman and John Dewey, Richard Rorty, the pragmatist philosopher, basically said that with a conscious creation of a national solidarity, without the conscious creation of a national solidarity, there can be no progress. And the unifying theme of that creative process needs to be, in the midst of globalization and destabilization, I don't like the word nationalism, but I'm going to use it here, that can honestly unite across class and identity, that can make inroads into the right's popularity, that can take charge of the global Brexit mood, and that can challenge the power of the corporation over the American citizenry. Now, many of you may know that Richard Rorty was a prophetic in what he wrote in 1998. And I'm going to do an extended quote before. How am I doing at time? Anybody? All right. This quote went viral after the Trump victory. So he wrote in Achieving Our Country. Members of labor unions and unorganized and unskilled workers will sooner or later realize that their government is not even trying to prevent wages from sinking or to prevent jobs from being exported. And around the same time, they'll realize the suburban white-collar workers, themselves desperately afraid of being downsized, are not going to let themselves be taxed to provide social benefits for anyone else. At that point, something will crack. The non-suburban electorate will decide the system has failed and start looking around for a strong man to vote for. Someone willing to assure them that once he is elected, the smug bureaucrats, the tricky lawyers, the overpaid bond salesmen, and worse, the postmodernist professors, will no longer be calling the shots. Once the strong man takes office, no one can predict what will happen. Now, nationalism is dangerous stuff. It's dangerous stuff anywhere, but it's dangerous stuff in a country like the United States with a history of settler colonialism, slavery, territorial expansion. But Abraham Lincoln pulled it off. Eugene Debs pulled it off. Both Roosevelts pulled it off. And I think Obama tried. I think he returned to Osawatomie, of course. And he gave a brilliant speech at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, talking about how dissent is the essence of American tradition, that the America we carry in our hearts lies on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And as he said, what greater expression of faith in the American experiment than this? That is John Lewis walking across that bridge. What greater form of patriotism is there than the belief that America is not yet finished, that we are strong enough to be self-critical, that each successive generation can look upon our imperfections and decide that it is in our power to remake this nation to more closely align with our highest ideals. Unfortunately, he had a neoliberal economic agenda that didn't jibe, I think, with this vision that he had. So, real quickly, and to sort of bring this towards a conclusion, I think that some sense of social patriotism that needs to be developed in order to not leave the question of the nation to, what's the saying that the patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels? Well, it can't be left to scoundrels. Will be sort of lost in this sort of vulnerable to the sterile sense of purpose, I think, that's offered by neoliberal individualism, or worse, the barbarism of dangerously cartoonish strongmen. Now, I'm well aware there are enormous problems with this construct, and I hope you guys will call me out on it when we have a few minutes. But I think the most obvious problem is the question of race and immigration. That the nation-state plays a really important role in creating insiders and outsiders, granting legitimacy. But I think there's a counterintuitive dimension to this. So people who do polling and things like this talk about priming, that you can change how people respond through priming. And actually, these people went out and did interviews on the Muslim ban, and did just ask them about the ban, and then talked about America and civic life in America and the meaning of America, and then asked them about the Muslim ban. And people were far more sympathetic to immigrants, to Muslims, with that priming. So if you have this sort of social architecture that is inclusive and visionary, people are more open. If, in fact, the idea of the nation state is left to people who are all about who's in, who's out, then you have a much more problematic version of the nation. And then I think the most obvious argument against this is that nationalism is just a toxic, dangerous thing. I am sort of tone deaf to it. I mean, I don't even understand. I can't even follow a football team or a basketball team because I have so few allegiances. But I think that blood and soil types, will never be won over to this. But I do think there is a rich hidden history and a hunger for a national community that demonstrates a deeper commitment to the well-being, welfare, and social esteem of our fellow citizens. Political scientist Noam Gidron argues that nationalism, for instance, whatever its limits, does not do what any other political unit does. It, quote, recognizes a basic moral intuition we have deep and encompassing obligations to those we consider our own, based on shared sense of membership in a community of fate. So in conclusion, to many, Donald Trump's presidency combined disturbing developments in Europe suggests that progressive politics are doomed by the rise of nationalism, that national solidarity is a threat. But I am arguing here today that I think it's a resource, and that one that people who care about the fate of workers ignore at their peril. Unlike abstract appeals to global humanitarian concerns, it's based on a solid foundation of national attachments, what Ben Anderson called the imagined community. So the progressive challenge in our time rests in not dismissing national pride, but in harnessing national solidarity in order to create a fair, more just society. Progressives have conceded the fight for national identity for fear of the dark side of the problem. But to paraphrase Tip O'Neill, all working class politics remains national. To ignore that aspect of America First and not recognize the pragmatic path it offers to a national developmental vision, from infrastructure to civic engagement, is to simply invite desperate and empty calls to make America great again. Thanks. I told my grad students I was going to give this talk, and they all but nailed me to the wall. They hated the idea, so I'm well primed to be hated. So, oh yeah, I guess we want to use the mics to get it on the recording. Oh, she gave up. Oh. Well, go ahead. I'll translate. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Headquarters, and over the border in Wisconsin, they just got the Foxconn
Yeah.
deal. And I think the states, and all the states around it are trying to attract each other's businesses into their states. And I think that actually mitigates against nationalist tendencies.
Yeah, so the argument is that interstate competition for investment and jobs argues against a sort of national vision. But fair enough? Yeah. Yeah, well, my first book was about interstate competition for jobs. So yeah, believe me, I'm well aware. Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, in my imagined world where this works, infrastructure construction becomes at the forefront of a national vision. And that can be shared without this downward harmonization of taxes and inducements to get people to come and work there. And I think, or even better yet, one of the things, it appears that Nashville lost its bid for Amazon because they turned down a proposition for public transportation. So in some ways, there are ways I think that these could work together, but I completely agree that this kind of interstate struggle and the race to the bottom, as they put it, is deeply problematic. But a strong federal minimum wage, as opposed to punishing municipalities that do raise their minimum wages, would obviously be an answer that's a bit of a pipe dream at this point. I understand, sir.
The growing of maybe apolitical automation seems to be a very big challenge to employment, particularly the middle class. And I haven't heard anyone really articulating a response to it, something flaky like handing everybody a check and putting us on the reservation.
Yeah. So I don't have to repeat that one. It was on the mic. Automation. Now, automation has been the, boogeyman since Frederick Winslow Taylor and Henry Ford. And I don't say that flippantly. It is a frightening thing, and it does appear that robotics is going to take over a tremendous amount of employment. And you made reference to, a guaranteed basic income. I'm not a big fan of the guaranteed basic income for exactly the reason that you mentioned. It feels like we're going to pay you just to sit there and what's the joke? The Factory of the Future has one person and one dog, and the person's there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure that the person doesn't touch the machines. I think that only through the building of a national economy, through rail, through bridges and airports, and all this actually provides jobs. But I think the only way to build political support for the actual construction of these types of things is through a civic vision. I don't think it happens through pity the unemployed, as much as I would like that to be the case. I don't think it happens because any technical reason that we think there's a trigger mechanism, and once unemployment hits 10%, we'll do this or whatever. No, I think it happens because we believe in something greater than ourselves. And the only thing I can come up with, I mean, if it was bananas, I'd say bananas, but I can't come up with that, is the nation. And I find it troubling, but I find it the best workaround. So I actually think what I'm arguing for works pretty much hand in glove with technological displacement.
Thanks for such a stimulating talk. So I had a couple challenges for you. I was just rereading Eldon Eisenach's Lost Promise of Progressivism. And it seems like you're discussing social solidarity, which he argues is very much the central progressive thing. Mm-hmm. And his point is, like, this is a language completely lost,
right,
after World War I.
Exactly.
So first challenge is, what evidence is there amongst the working classes in the 1970s in any way for a commitment to that kind of social solidarity or civic patriotism? And the second is the post-9/11 nationalism, which is a belligerent, a militaristic nationalism mobilized by George W. Bush. So nationalism's from a progressive point of view,
right,
dangerous in a couple of ways.
Yes.
Ethno-racial nationalism, but also belligerent militaristic, yes, nationalism. Yes. And again, it's hard to think of this sort of civic nationalism that looks hopefully beyond national boundaries in some sense, taking hold or having any root in our current political system, again, mm-hmm, in the last 50 years.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And your first question, did you actually say the 1970s?
Well, I was asking, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, see, I don't think there's any hope in the 70s. I think everything's falling apart, and the new paradigm hasn't been built. It's the last days of the old sort of post-war New Deal paradigm. So I don't see anything there. What I do see now, for what it's worth, and I ended The Great Exception actually with this very brief speculation that maybe the progressive era, if you need a model, that might be the one to look at. Why? Because it's cross-class, unlike the New Deal, which is very much about sort of blocks of class interest. It brings together religious groups, immigrant groups, reformists, suffragettes, this whole kind of, and coalitions break apart and are formed, but there's this almost kind of, they're in this fluid that is constantly changing but present in the progressive era. Its malleability, its undefinability, its richness, but its civicness is the essence of it. So I agree. I think I agree with what you said. Just not the 70s. I don't see anything there. Yeah, since the 70s, I think that the post-60s left gave up on the nation. Right? They started spelling America with a K after Vietnam or whatever the case may be. Michael Harrington said that we, the New Left, obviously not me, wasn't part of the New Left, took away God and flag and put nothing in their place, right? And I think that's a problem that people who are interested in this cause have continued to suffer from. And so the belligerent nationalism that you and I both fear is essentially a product, I think, of giving up the game. And that you don't harvest this, you construct it. You go out and you say it. It's that priming question. It's pushing a sensibility that challenges that, that whether you take a knee at a football game is your test of whether you're an American or not, right? No, the question of American is whether you shoot citizens in the street, right? Then you're not. That's how you flip that question, right? That's an un-American thing to do because that's a citizen.
So my question for you, just talking about civic nationalism and things like that, and you brought up how there was like a primary for talking about the Muslim ban to people and sort of, I don't know, asking them a serious question but with a pretty package so that they can be more open to it. But do you think that sort of thing is problematic in a way, because when you're talking about including everyone, then the idea of the other, the woman, the slave, the alien, like all those other people outside of this patriotic system get excluded?
Right. I am 100% sympathetic with the essence of your question. My problem is, how do you get there? And I can't figure out another route there. And there's flaws in this idea. I think important flaws that we need to hold people, including me, accountable to. But I simply think that the biggest, most capacious space for this could be this avenue. I'm not saying it's a silver bullet. I'm not saying it solves all the problems at all. I just think that you have that the idea of America has to be recaptured from people who have captured it for very, very limited purposes. And that there has to be a place for all the people you just mentioned. And their stories of exclusion and their triumphant stories of inclusion. And that has to be the American story. And that's a very hard, difficult, long struggle. I'm not saying we just start waving the flag around and everything's fine.
Exactly.
That's not what I'm saying at all, right? That this is a long-term generational political project.
Exactly. And also, lastly, but I feel like I see where you're coming from, but then it's like, it seems kind of hard and reachable when America in itself is a system that's built off of immigrants, and yet immigrants now are an issue.
Right.
When we're all not from this country.
Right.
And
All
then
of us.
that, excluding, Native Americans
Right.
and the tribes that were
Right.
here before, but then it's like now we have these things like a Muslim ban, but none of us are from here, but now we're arguing about who deserves to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And then by that, then identifying with, are you American enough to exist in America?
Right. And this is a problem we have to go through. But it's important, I think, especially for young people, to know that prior to the immigration restrictions of 1924, this defined American politics between 1877 and 1924. And it reappeared after 1965 when we deracialized what was a discriminatory, exclusive immigration policy. America is a nation of immigrants. America is also a long, horrible, racist argument over who should be in and who shouldn't. It's not, this is nothing new. But I think, and I think that the problem with my argument is that if the nation state becomes the sort of arbiter on that, then you're actually drawing lines between legitimate legal immigration and illegal immigration. Right now, the system works on fuzzing that boundary. It's a wholly dysfunctional system. I think in my dream version, this includes very clear paths to citizenship for people. And that becomes, a staged path to citizenship. And that becomes a source of legitimacy. Because what's interesting is, who are the most patriotic people? they're immigrants. They love it. You know, they're pretty excited. You know, for those who aren't being, you know, torn from their families and sent back to El Salvador, or wherever they're being sent back to. And so I think there's actually, if you can construct this sort of path to citizenship model alongside this kind of social patriotic thing I'm trying to talk about, then you might be able to begin to work this immigration problem. Because let's not fool ourselves that we got a solution now, right? I mean, unless you want to open up borders completely or shoot people as they come across the border, you know, it is a messy, conflicted thing. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't have a silver bullet again, but I think this might advance it a little bit. I really like your questions, though.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Are you trying to pull the hook on me? No, okay, all right, okay.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for a very provocative talk. You've talked a lot about some of the dangerous implications of this reliance on nationalism. I'd like to push back a little bit, though, about the way that you conceptualize the nation state and naturalize it. Of course, you pointed to Benedict Anderson's work about the nation state as a long-term ideological project. It had to be built from someplace. And I think that the assumption that it's completely natural now could perhaps be tested a little bit. And one way that I would like to suggest and want to hear sort of your reaction is thinking about one of the big protests or conflicts in this new phase 2 of the culture war is, as you mentioned, the kneeling protests during NFL games. But another one during the 2016 election and carrying into 2017 was over the Confederate flag, and even going back to 2015, and Confederate monuments. And the way that many supporters of Donald Trump used those symbols,
Yes.
which are not national symbols, in fact are historically anti-American symbols, use those to express their Americanism. I think adds complexity to your argument that the nation state is really at the core of their identities and is the tool, the lever that we could use to try to convince them to pursue a better path.
Yeah. I agree with the essence of your question. But I think what we have to keep at the forefront in our thinking about this is that the way the kneeling, the flag, the whatever, are used to prop up this idea of America in a vacuum. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I guess my question could be boiled down to, why are these people using the Confederate flag to express their Americanism?
Yeah, right.
I mean, they're saying something, though, by choosing
I mean, the Confederate battle flag, let's be clear.
Yeah, or rallying around Confederate monuments. Like, this is not a part of
Right.
an American history that Franklin Roosevelt's invoking. So I guess
No, but Franklin Roosevelt is working hand in glove with the segregationist Democratic Party.
Yes, but he's not waving the Confederate flag. And I feel that many of the the surrogates is the favorite word now, but the surrogates for Donald Trump are using these symbols.
Yes.
And so I think that there's something more complex going on than simply using the nation state as the category for identity
I
for these
see
people.
what you're saying. Yeah. But to the degree that you could, like, I guess I would say dissent has to be part and parcel, I think, of any kind of social vision for what the state might be. I mean, and the argument has to be made over and over that conflict over these issues is real. But I think if you counter with what is American, it's a pretty strong, I think it can be a strong argument against the use of the secessionist Confederate battle flag used to rally states to support slavery. to defend slavery. I mean, but I didn't really hear that argument that much. I just heard they're racist, which was a fine argument. But I don't think it's the one that gets us furthest in terms of defeating that kind of idea. Why? Because I think people, I go back to smashing Corollas, it could be waving Confederate flags. The Confederate flag was very popular in the 70s, right? You know, yeah, Skinner, right? Turn it up. Because I think people were, you know, in these moments of confusion, people are looking for something, some kind of identity. And there's nothing there right now, I think, that is meaning. So people see that, the rebel yell and whatever, and they're like, yeah, I got something there, right? You're never going to win over the real blood and soil types. Right.
Thank you for your talk. Definitely provocative. Just a few things I've been thinking about. I'll try to keep it short. I'm always intrigued when people refer to this country as a country of immigrants, in light of the fact that peoples of African descent, if they've been here since prior to 1865, African peoples did not come here voluntarily, but it came as enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that discourse of we're all a country of immigrants really shrouds a very ugly and complicated history, or really the centrality of white supremacy to the very making of this country. I guess what I would say is, and I hope I don't sound too cynical, I'm still perhaps naively optimistic, but I am convinced that perhaps a third of white America would have no problem putting peoples of color in concentration camps or killing people or something like that. And I am convinced that when you said that killing people, killing citizens is not American, I would say that's actually fundamentally American.
Sure.
But I think in terms of a vision, a kind of a democratic vision, and perhaps I'm thinking a bit about Dr. Trotter's talk this morning, how he ended with talking about how St. Clair Drake and Horace Cayton in Black Metropolis talked about how the South Side of Chicago, how the problems in the South Side were linked to a global systems of inequality, empire, racism, what have you. But I think embedded in that is a kind of culture of opposition that could be found. And again, I don't want to romanticize these communities, but the kind of culture of opposition, a kind of alternative worldview that we saw in history, of, say, of slave insurrections, thinking in terms of a model, perhaps, not perhaps, I would say, Reconstruction, and the ways in which black governments or those Reconstruction governments tried to rethink the role of government, the state, citizenship, the meaning of freedom, Black Lives Matter, black queer, black feminist movements of our contemporary era. Again, kind of occupy, kind of, again, alternative ways of imagining community citizenship. And I'm not convinced that, and again, I hear where you're coming from. I'm not so sure if even the kind of American liberal tradition can provide us with the tools that we will need to free ourselves. So thank you.
As opposed to what? I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. My new book that I'm writing is on Black Belt, Alabama. I'm not naive about how the world works. I'm not naive about how capitalism works, slavery, the whole thing. I essentially regard this as a kind of a rearguard action because I don't think the racially conscious anarcho-feminist revolution is going to happen. That I think this is a pragmatic approach to the neoliberal order. Maybe something else might grow out of it. But as much as I would like to, change everything, there's a tremendous inertia that you've even suggested that prevents, I think, a deeper, more profound change in this country. This is a very, very conservative country, right? How do you work with that, right? And how do you work with that? And I think Reconstruction's a great example, right? I mean, that's, federal Reconstruction was not so bad, right? And then they pulled out the troops, and then they killed black voters. But that was part of a federal vision. Because I think you're right that violence is on the edge, that society, that the United States is sort of loaded with violence, it's pregnant with violence. And how do you massage that? How do you find a way to channel that in a way that can lead to a brighter place and not a darker place? And that's all I'm grasping for. And I think you know kind of where I'm coming from here. And you may not agree with the answer, and I totally understand why that would be the case. But this is just me struggling through, 20 years of scholarship and still trying to make sense of the world. And I find one last thing. I find the argument that, global neoliberal order and, slavery and capital mobility and exploitation and immigration and, that is overwhelming to me, and I think it's overwhelming to most regular people who have a vote, who have a say, and that there has to be something, a place that you can look to and talk about who you are together, who we are together, and that's all we got. But thank you.
Yeah, I've been informed on the last question. So it strikes me that this national conversation, and even I think to a degree your conversation here tonight, is really kind of driven to respond to this kind of imagined lost population of white working class voters, when especially if we're talking about Trump's election, has been shown as largely middle and upper class white voters who fear loss of status rather than economic anxiety. And so I guess I'm just wondering kind of more broadly, what about this question of national identity and unity oriented not toward that perspective, but oriented toward those who continue to face oppression and have historically faced oppression, and not just fearing loss of status. So I guess I'm wondering, what about like reparations or ending mass incarceration as first steps if we're even going to start talking about some kind of national unity?
Yeah, sure. So the first part of your question about the nature of the Trump vote, I think, has been grossly misunderstood in the world. Is it race? Is it economic anxiety? Well, if you don't know that race and class are connected in American history, you do not understand anything about American history, right? And so those reports drive me absolutely crazy. But that said, first steps, incarceration. I mean, yeah, the inhumane nature of the carceral state, would be first on my list. It's to take care of. But how do you get there? I mean, obviously, it's a product of a whole host of things. But my dream, and I'm sure some of you would think it's naive, is that you don't treat citizens like this, just like you don't shoot them. I mean, and so that that becomes the test, it's a highly racialized incarceration system, but for a lot of Americans, the only way to think about this, and I know you aren't going to like this, the only way a lot of Americans are going to be willing to think about this, if it's not about race, if it's just about fair sentencing and things like that, right? I mean, if it's explicitly about the incarceration of African Americans, they won't care. They will not care. Yeah, sorry. We can talk later. Yeah.
Thank you.
The last one. That's what you said on the last one. You're all very
pushed my way in
patient.
here, that's all right. Hi.
Hi.
I think it's a really interesting idea that you've proposed, and I'm not so bothered by the idea that nationalism is dangerous, although I think it is dangerous. It's a dangerous tool, but I think some situations require dangerous weapons to defend oneself, and we certainly, I think, are in a dangerous situation. But I think that my question is, when I get the sort of idea that you're saying, that we've ceded the ground of the American nation to the sort of blood and soil nationalists, I think, though, is that really true, right? Because there are alternate visions of the American nation, and you brought up Barack Obama, who certainly very much pursued and pushed forward another one. One that's really present in our current political climate is the view of the Dreamers, right, who have a really well and very much a patriotic, articulated vision of what it means to be an American and what America is all about as a dream. And if you ask me, most of them are more patriotic to America than a cynical old Chicana like me.
No, that's exactly what I was suggesting.
So there's this other
yeah.
vision out there,
Yep.
but it doesn't appeal to a large variety of the electorate. And I'm not sure if it's so much because we've ceded the idea of America, sort of ceded that discursive ground, as it is that the notion of what it means to be a white American is
that's the problem.
inexorably linked to white supremacy.
Right.
And that maybe the problem isn't so much we need to reclaim America, but that white people need to have a conversation about how to be a white American.
I'm working on it. I absolutely agree. I think I'm about to get the hook here, so I'll be brief, but it's a really important point, and I think the Dreamers are a fantastic example of kind of the type of thing and the type of space that could be really positive. The problem is, I think there needs to be a greater national discussion onto which that can glom. Obama had it rhetorically. I don't think he had it economically. And of course, he had political problems. He's not an American. He's a Muslim. He's a blah blah blah. All this ridiculous stuff, right? Or not, the most Christian person in the White House since Jimmy Carter is not a Christian. I mean, it's crazy, right? But I think the problem of nationalism as a white supremacist project is ultimately where this falls apart, and has to, if this has any traction at all, it would be because we kept our feet to the fire on this question at all times. And again, I offer it not as my dream, but as the ultimate workaround. So, thanks.
Just real fast, I'd like to acknowledge the people who made this conference possible. It's been a long day. Appreciate you all hanging in there. But the staff of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, for all the work they've done for all the months, especially Scott St. Louis over here, they deserve a hand. Okay. Scott, why don't you come on up? Scott, come on up. He's going to give you some final housekeeping.
I'm going to keep it really short, 2 sentences. We'll see you back just outside in the exhibition hall at 8:15 to walk over to the MHA Awards ceremony. Commence 4th breakout session if you haven't already. Thanks.